So once again, for those of you accustomed with the aristocracy of building technology, you will know that I'm not Blair Gardiner, but somehow some environmental conditions prevent him from being here. And so you'll have to bear with me and pretend that I'm slightly older, slightly more knowledgeable about construction, and that speak with a slightly more Australian accent. So, if I can wear my other glasses, that one I think. So, I'm going to pretend that I am Blair and take a few minutes of your time to take you in two different directions. One which is very much close or in to what Peter Scriver was saying, particularly when reminiscing about our common work with Bharat. And that is the passage from technology and culture to technology and political economy. And at the same time, I want to use this. I mean, Blair wanted to use this as an opportunity to show you the seeds that were planted 10, 15 years ago when we first started working on this particular project, which was a research on digital outsourcing and what was happening seemingly around the world 10 or 15 years ago with the onslaught of computer platforms and digital connections across vast areas of the world with different wealth per capita and therefore labour differentials. Now, look at the title. The title is Drafting Cultures, Architecture and Digital Outsourcing. This was initially our interest, but eventually as we moved forward, we realized that what we were trying to do, simply as an investigation into the advances of technology, was quickly turning into something else, which was an investigation on professional cultures. So here the title, or the first two words of the title, can be interpreted in two ways. One, by using the second, essentially by focusing on the second word as a noun, cultures, which is qualified through the term drafting. The second one, instead, the second way of thinking about it is by looking at it as an activity, in which case drafting becomes the verb and cultures becomes the object of that activity. Now, this comes from a ARC, Australian Research Council Discovery Grant, which is the one that Peter Scriver was alluding to and our first encounter into the digital laboratory. Digital outsourcing in architecture, opportunities for Australian firms or perils for Australian workforce. And it was couched in political economy terms, essentially to get the grant. But what we are interested in reality, was something that had come out recently from this book, Robert Raich's book on the work of nations. So most of you will know Robert Raich was the Secretary of Labour under the first Clinton administration, and today is a very vocal adversary of Donald Trump's presidency. But at the time, he was a professor of economics. At the time, he actually came out with this argument that the future of the world can actually be foreseen by looking at the division between two different categories of workers. Those who analyze symbols, symbolic analysts, and those that produce or execute routines. Those who analyze symbols need to rely on their own knowledge and or ability to pass judgments. Those that produce routines need to follow instructions. And Raich's argument was that America didn't have anything to fear from the advancing transitional economies because no matter what would happen, America would have the brain. So it was a difference between those who design and those who draw. If you can keep those who design within your own economy, then you can actually outsource the rest of the activity because the assets will eventually come back to the source. And so we produce something, some of you may have read it, which is called routine production or symbolic analysis, that try to deal with the future of the architectural profession in this new globalized economy that would permit eventually an international division of labour. And these were the questions that I'm not going to bore you with, but essentially, what is the level of engagement of architectural firms, of firms that produce documents for architectural Australian firms in different parts of the world? What are the factors that affect the performance of these firms around the world once again? And how do influences that have to do with culture, with the ability to translate design intent, and also have to do with the culture of documentation that exists in particular place, do in fact affect the performance of the work done? So in order to do this, we did something very naughty for a research project, which had to do with pretending we were someone else. So we put on the garments, the dress of the client, our research team, and we started becoming a client for a number of architectural firms willing to give us their services around the world, in Argentina, in India, in the Philippines, and we also had subcontractors in Melbourne. All along we had, I think, 12 firms and a number of projects. So, what did we do? And how do you actually organize a distant collaboration in architectural documentation terms? This was us. We managed to convince a number of firms to give us existing projects. We sort of disguised their real identity and then produced architectural documentation that had to do with a particular program, with examples of our notional firm. I think maybe Peter Scriver would have been the CEO of that firm. How would we actually work in Australia? Then we produce computer-aided design material for these firms to work on. We produced a sketch design component that was part of this package to be shipped all around the world. We produced some details. We attached some technical documentation that you would find from Australian suppliers. And then we started. And so then what was a DEM? What would then do in relation to the supply of such professional information? And so we started receiving documentation from these 12, 14 firms around the world that showed that on the surface they had responded to the task. But then we unleashed the power of our building technology experts, namely Blair Gardiner and other people, and started to look at the drawings in details. And what happened here was strange, because essentially our ability or our intent to get into the market of international services was met with frustration and with elation. Frustration on our part, anytime we discovered that the people who actually had developed skills in that trade didn't want to engage with us. In a sense, they found it a bit too tricky, a bit too dangerous. They didn't want to reveal their wares or their skills. On the other hand, we had a number of young firms that were actually able and willing to become part of this market. Then the elation transformed itself into frustration and despair when we started to look at the number of mistakes and the ability or inability to translate design intent or design instructions into construction notation. So some of our teams spend weeks, months, almost years going tirelessly through the various drawings. And then we started to look at the performance of the various firms depending on which country they were coming from. So here you see only one example. We have plenty of these projects. One firm from Buenos Aires, Argentina, one from Kanpur, one from Delhi, one from Manila, and a home firm in Australia. Of course, these don't want to have any pretension of generalization, generalizability. They have to be taken as ideal types in the Weberian sense of the word. Nevertheless, they do provide us with incredible information. And they have to, essentially they tell us that the moment we start looking very carefully at the performance of these firms, the amount of mistakes that are made in the interpretation of design intent or the translation of design intent are enormous. So these are the Australian, this is the Australian firms that serves as a gauge, which is not, the work of which is not precise by any means, but then you look at how this exactly the same project is actually being produced under other conditions. Now, if I had time, I could actually go into the differences that exist between a firm that operates in this business in the Philippines versus a firm that operates in this business in Argentina or in India. There is one thing which is possibly, it is critical to point out, and it's something that has to do with culture. The Filipino firm seemed to be dealing much better with the instructions. Not because it was a more qualified firm, but because it was actually part of an environment that was heavily influenced by American practice. And that's how the building market worked there. Whereas in other instances, certainly Buenos Aires and India, we were dealing with the practices that were certainly not part, at least in terms of the context, of something that would remotely resemble Australian culture. So it became evident, two things became evident, that first of all, you can't use outsourcing the way the pundits of information technology would want you to believe. Because no matter what you want to do, if you really want to engage with a different culture, even from a technical point of view, you need to establish an ongoing collaboration with them, which essentially, to a large extent, makes the idea or the advantages of moving overseas void, null, because you need to train these people and engage into a constant relationship with them. But the other thing is that still there are firms in the world, and we had lots of firms that contacted us over the months, over the years, that do engage in this activity, regardless of the consistency that one can obtain between the supply, the demand, and the supply of the service, which, of course, brings one question, which is possibly at the center, it was the kernel of Peter's affabulations about technology and culture. Is that particular service, that architectural service that we're seeking, was being provided as a professional service or as a commodity? So something that essentially exists within itself, within the means of production and within the matter, the paper that was produced, or something that instead implied, relied, and built upon a professional tradition. And when we went and looked at the characteristics of the firm that were working with us, Blair Gardiner spent several months traveling around India and staying with some of the firms that were working with us, we realized that in most cases, there were two types of firms. Firms that were inexperienced, but still architectural firms in the true sense of the word, that were trying to expand their markets thanks to advances in technology, the image on the left. And then there was a second type of firms. Firms that were not architectural in themselves, but actually were owned, and were being developed by entrepreneurs, business people who wanted to jump on the bandwagon on information and technology and distant delivery of architectural services. So anyway, there is a different number of categories that could be used. But why is this important? And why we thought that this was important at the time? Because somehow these categories are not or were not being considered within the architectural discussion. Differently, unlike to what happened in the United States, for instance, in the 20th century. This is this book written by George Barnett Johnston. It's called Drafting Culture, A Social History of Architectural Graphic Standards, that shows how the preparation of a body, a population of routine producers, as opposed to symbolic analysts. So routine producers are the ones that very primitively were actually sitting in those offices. It was in fact a fundamental moment in the development of the architectural profession in the United States. And at some point, the architectural graphic standards would have to acquire the industrial function that they have in the United States today, because it is only by having that level of technological standardization that meaningful variations from that could occur through symbolic analysis. Now, the second reason, so in a sense, one has to go through this passage in the evolution of an evolving profession. The other thing is that, and I'm possibly going into the political economy aspects of this, is that any external economy that tries to use drafting as a service, one way or another, is actually interested into inserting itself into the industry of that country. And this is the proof of that. This is a very famous book, which is the Handbook of Architectural Practice, which was published in 1953 in Italy, and it was funded with funds from the Marshall Plan. And so the Marshall Plan and the Fulbright Association, or the United States Information Service, went to the architectural profession in Italy and said, look, we will actually fund the handbook required for the reconstruction of the country at the completion of World War II, if you do us a favor. It was not literally those words, but if you allow us to put technical systems that belong to American manufacturers into the handbook of Italian practice. And what's interesting is that if you open that book today, students, architectural students, actually stopped using it only a few years ago. I studied with that at university in Italy. You will find that the American systems are in. And why are they in? This book was produced by a collation of academics and practitioners that is not unlike the group of people that exist here at CEPT. Some of the champions of modern architecture and eventually, postmodern evolutions of that. And they said, let's not worry. Let's put any technical piece of documentation that the United States Information Agency wants us to put in, because one way or another, we'll remain the guardians of that information, and we'll make sure that in our universities, those systems will not be taken up because they defy construction logics and industrialization in our country. And so for, 60, 70 years, the American tables of the Manuale dell'Architetto in Italy have remained a souvenir, a form of technological exotism into the standards, the graphic standards of the architectural profession. So unless there is a cultivated profession that looks after the industrial aspects of the profession, of the construction industry, that would not otherwise touch cultivated institutions such as this one, everything can happen. But one still has the power to understand the wave of change and sort of metabolize or internalize it into it. And in conclusion, one should not forget, after all, that buildings like this were in fact produced for people in England in the first part of the 19th century. These are the headquarters of the Architectural Association in London, which didn't start as an architectural school, but it started as a place where draftsmen, drafting people, routine producers could actually get an education that would eventually turn them into symbolic analysts. Thank you very much. So, we can stop. We can stop for 20 minutes and we'll come back to the lectern with Indian temples and incredible computer technology. Thank you.